But welcome. My name is Dr. Wingate. I am a licensed psilocybin facilitator in Portland, Oregon. I'm also co-founder of 7 Gate Sanctuary, a licensed psilocybin service center in Portland, Oregon. My doctorate is Chinese medicine. My postdoctorate has been in clinical neuroscience for the last 15 years. Clinically, I've been working in neurorehabilitation, specifically focusing on traumatic brain injury, stroke, and PTSD. So that's a lot of my background. And then, of course, things have significantly changed in Oregon over the last couple of years with the legalization of psilocybin. And as soon as the opportunity arose to actually get formal training and be able to do this above ground, I was in there as quick as I could. And now that's where I found myself. I'm co-founder of one of the first service centers, a little bit closer to the mic. Is that any better? If I project a little bit, is that okay? All right, cool. So I'll project a little bit more. But that's a little bit about my background. This is my colleague.
My name is Dr. Rachel Turetzky. I have a PhD in clinical psychology with an emphasis in depth psychology. I've been working with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, now called Psycon Therapeutics, for the past 10 plus years, as an adherence rater on their MDMA PTSD studies. And that informs a lot of my current work with psychedelic guidance and psychedelic integration and offering service eventually at the 7 Gate Sanctuary.
Yeah, Dr. Rachel is one of our integration specialists, alongside each other in that capacity as well. Today we're going to be presenting on the modeling of transpersonal and non-ordinary states and the integration of the psychedelic experience. So we're going to take a look at sort of a lot of people have heard what the psychedelic experience can be like, and have heard varying descriptions. We are going to put out some information relating to how that can be put into a usable model to allow for better understanding of sort of the human psyche and how those sort of experiences play into that dynamic, and also how it can inform methods of integration work. Integration being a key component following a psychedelic journey. You can have a very profound psychedelic journey if you don't do anything to really integrate it or work on yourself following that, or take that information and start applying it, then it can kind of unfortunately go to the wayside. So we'll talk about how we can have sort of a framework for these psychedelic or these transpersonal experiences, and how it can help inform how to work with that. So we'll go ahead and ready to get started. All right. So we're going to start. If anybody was here, who was here for my talk yesterday? Okay, so a few of you, I touched on critical periods. This is sort of like the forefront of a lot of the neuroscience and psychedelic studies right now as it relates to how it impacts somebody on a psycho-emotional side. And if you're here tomorrow and listening to my talk, we're going to talk about how potential applications and more of a physical component as it relates to stroke, TBI, and whatnot. Critical periods is, like I say, it's sort of at the forefront, so there's a fair amount, there's relatively new research taking a look at how psychedelics can help open up critical periods. And critical periods are developmental periods that, generally speaking, every adult goes through at certain phases in their life. And so you have these critical imprint periods that happen where certain skills are acquired, you learn certain skills, and then they sort of get locked in. And so what can happen is there's a rigidity there. So if you have a negative early life experience and you have what would be considered or called a negative impact in a particular critical period or developmental period, that it sort of gets locked in. But what they're taking a look at now is the potential for psychedelics to reopen windows of critical periods and be able to revisit these and sort of reassess or modify that so that it's either more functional or so that it can be utilized in a better way, or to work through some of these trauma experiences or some of these locked-in patterns that might be detrimental or holding somebody back. So we're going to go through a few quotes here from some recent research with critical periods. So there are developmental critical periods with exquisite sensitivity to environmental input. Psychedelics may remove the brakes on adult neuroplasticity. If you were here yesterday, I was talking about neuroplasticity a fair amount. If you come my talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk even more about neuroplasticity and how psychedelics play into that. But here, it talks about how psychedelics may remove the brake on adult neuroplasticity. So as people develop and get older, the neuroplasticity tends to wane over time. So during developmental periods, there's a rapid brain change and rapid neural connections that are being made, and then that kind of slows down, and there's neural pruning, and your brain starts to kind of acclimate. And so here we're taking a look at the potential for psychedelics to reopen the critical period or reduce the brake on the neuroplasticity that tends to happen in adulthood. Oop. Do you want to move that along? Yep. And I'll just read it out here. So well, it's going to be easier this way so that the mic gets me. Another quote that's relevant is the ability to reinstate social reward learning in adulthood is paralleled by metaplastic. And again, if you were here yesterday, we talked about the difference between neuroplasticity and the specificity of metaplasticity. It's essentially increased synaptic plasticity or plasticity of plasticity, how much plasticity can be there. So paralleled by metaplastic restoration of oxytocin-mediated long-term depression in the nucleus accumbens, it's an area in the brain, near the brainstem, identification of differentially expressed genes in the open state. So this is an open critical period versus a closed state where there is no plasticity happening. Provides evidence that reorganization of the extracellular matrix is a common downstream mechanism when it comes to psychedelics. And, I think you have the old one pulled up, because that's not even what's up here. The next slide. Did I just get ahead? I just got ahead. My apologies. This quote is the ability as relates to psychedelics, the ability to reopen the social reward learning critical period is a shared property across psychedelic drugs. The time course of critical period reopening is proportional to the duration of acute subjective effects. So I talked about this a little bit yesterday too. There are certain psychedelics, ketamine has a relatively short period in terms of how long the trip is or the psychedelic experience is, and the window of plasticity or the opening of the critical window is relatively shorter than compared to, say, psilocybin or MDMA, where the journey tends to be anywhere from about 4, 5, 6 hours, and the neuroplastic window tends to be more like 3 weeks, as opposed to with ketamine, you're talking in 48 hours to about a week or so. And then we talked about ibogaine yesterday as well, which is a very long psychedelic journey. You're talking 24, 36 hours. It's a very intense experience, and there seems to be a correlation with a longer period in which neuroplasticity or this opening of the critical period tends to be. So there is that correlation. I want to go ahead and... Yeah, but I read it. So do you want to skip ahead to the next one?
Okay, this quote is by Gould. So it might be that if what feels like to be in that altered state of consciousness or that mystical experience that we think of with psychedelics is just what it feels like to reopen those critical periods. Brings us to, so Revis is the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics and the entropic brain theory by Dr. Robert Parham Harris. He proposes that psychedelics work to relax the precision weighting of pathologically overweighted priors, underpinning various expressions of mental illness, increased sensitization, enables the potential revision and de-weighting of overweighted priors. Psychedelics can bring about the revision of other heavily weighted, high-level priors not directly related to mental health, such as those underlying partisan and/or overly confident political, religious, and/or philosophical perspectives. So this kind of supports also, if anybody's here familiar with Timothy Leary back in the early 60s, had some experiments that he was doing it's called the Concord Prison Experiment. And so he was working with trying to reduce recidivism. And with the results, at the time it went from, I think at the time it was about a 60% recidivism rate to those who participated in the psilocybin program. It was down to, I think it reduced to about 20%, which is pretty amazing. So it really helps to help people to transform, question your beliefs about yourself. That, like Dr. Wingate was saying, that the imprinting, the conditions that you have when you show up in the world, experience yourself, your belief systems that affect your reality tunnels and how you navigate reality, your experience of reality. And so you take somebody who's got these really kind of repeated patterns of this is all I'm worth, this is all capable of, this is how I live my life, and it helps to really shift that internal narrative and that just who you believe yourself to be. So, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'll get into it in the next slide, which is talking about Albus. So Albus is an extension of Rebus. Rebus, again, being the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. It's the proposed idea by Robin Harris that it allows for more malleability in terms of sort of our thought patterns, or being able to revisit our belief systems, or different rigid philosophies that we may have either been raised with or that we've adopted over time, and that psychedelics allow for some flexibility in this. I make mention of Albus just because this is something that's sort of branched off of that, or is grown out of that, by Dr. Adam Saffron. It essentially brings in how lower doses impact that. So he states that the relaxed beliefs still hold true with larger doses, but when it comes to lower doses, because a lot of individuals who are not having these breakthrough experiences where it may actually create a lot of malleability in the thought processes, that lower doses such as microdosing may actually be reaffirming to somebody's worldview, or it certainly elevates sensory input. And so without the dramatic transpersonal experience, that it can actually that the smaller doses can actually reinforce philosophies or belief systems. So there is that dynamic that comes into play when it comes to dosing.
This further supports the whole importance of reopening critical periods and reimprinting. So further to Dr.
Yep.
It is proposed that the principal functional effect of the 5-HT2A receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, stimulation is to relax prior assumptions or beliefs held at multiple levels of the brain's functional hierarchy, perceptually, emotionally, cognitively, and philosophically, for example, in terms of biases. In doing so, it opens a door to heightened sensitivity to context, an ideal precondition for effective change. Okay,
and for those who aren't here for the neuroscience of psychedelics, 5-HT, as Dr. Turetzky said, anytime you see 5-HT, that's serotonin. Most psychedelics, especially the classic psychedelics, work on these serotonin 2A receptors. So that's what when it says 5-HT2A, that's what that is. Okay. Also briefly talked on this yesterday, but there's an idea of canalization and the idea of plasticity when it comes to psychedelics. So canalization is the idea that certain thought patterns, we tend to reiterate or work through very similar thought patterns, and as we do that, our brain creates more neural connections that sort of reinforce that, and these patterns get further reinforced because the more that you have a similar line of thought, the more efficient that communication happens in the brain, and so it gets more rigid in a sense and more locked in, and so it creates these sort of canals or these ridges of thought patterns and thought processes. And neuroplasticity that can be induced through psychedelics, as demonstrated on the lower image here. There's the idea, this is in relation to depression, that depressed thoughts or negative thoughts create these sort of canals of thought patterns, and you end up with this landscape that looks like it has a bunch of divots in it, and the application of psychedelics sort of stretches that fabric out or resets that landscape, or like I mentioned yesterday, it's almost like if you're skiing or snowboarding and there are the firmly laden tracks and then you get a fresh coat of snow, that it's a lot easier to create your own new tracks and essentially go wherever you want, as opposed to having to adhere to the tracks that are already in place. So this can relate to a number of different things, as was found in the quote by Robin, Dr. Carhart-Harris, in terms of negative cognitive biases, functional neurological disorders, which I'll be talking a little bit more about tomorrow, trigger-specific anxieties, addictions, eating and image disorders, and obsessions or compulsions as well. So it goes far beyond the social aspect that's been taken a look at with critical periods. That's how a lot of the more recent critical period research has sort of developed out of, is they were taking a look at social reward networks, and specifically with octopuses. So they gave octopuses MDMA, and octopuses are not inherently social creatures. And so they gave them MDMA and saw how social they became. And they found that it opened these critical windows of social relation and sociability. And so they then found that was really, really interesting and profound, because a lot of the brain structures that we talk about with psychedelics and how they work, octopuses don't have. So it kind of opened a whole new window in that realm of how we look at that. But then they started applying that social aspect, taking a look at humans and taking a look at it across the board with a number of different psychedelics, and it seemed to have this commonality, this common feature, to be able to open these critical windows, and that it's much more than just the social component. So that's kind of the key takeaways as far as that goes. Now, there is a term that's been around for quite some time, and it's kind of gotten buried to an extent. But everything that we've been talking about in terms of critical windows and opening this neuroplasticity and things like that is not a completely new concept. There are new applications and there are new ways that it's being looked at. It's being reinforced by modern neuroscience, which is absolutely great. We're able to take a look at the mechanisms and really understand that a lot better. But way back in the 60s, when they were doing a lot of the original psychedelic research, there's a man by the name of Dr. John Lilly. Anybody familiar with John Lilly? Maybe one, two? Okay, he was the inventor of isolation tanks, sensory deprivation tanks, and he was also doing a fair amount of study with various psychedelics, ketamine, LSD, and things like that. And so he is a fantastic book if you're interested in this sort of material that we're talking about in terms of sort of revisiting oneself or reevaluating oneself and initiating change in one's life. His book is Programming and Metaprogramming the Human Biocomputer. And metaprogramming was a term that he used to talk about the ability to, again, meta being programming of programming. So it's the ability to take a look at your own life circumstances, life philosophies, belief systems that you may have carried through your life, and being able to take a look at that and reevaluate it and see if it's something worth hanging on to or whether it's not worth revising, and then different applications of how to potentially revise those. So that's John Lilly's work. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, so Dr. Wingate and I also have another project that we work on together. It's called Eight Circuit Ascension, and we have a forthcoming book. And that's like the crux of using Timothy Leary, which we'll get more into this in however many slides forward. But the Eighth Circuit model of consciousness, and so the Sixth Circuit is the metaprogramming circuit, and that's basically, as Dr. Wingate shared, is just being able to reevaluate your belief systems. We're all raised with our, in our family systems, our beliefs, that religions or political beliefs, just so many different ways that we're influenced. And then at the end of the day, it's like, who are we actually, and how much do those beliefs align with our authentic self? And as a therapist, something I notice with a really common thing with clients coming in is how people they feel pressure to live their life according to other people's expectations of them, or that they feel like they have no sense of self, or they don't know their own identities. And so with metaprogramming is a way to really explore, well, what are my beliefs? How am I in the world? How do I see myself? And is this really in alignment with who I really am meant to be in life?
Or have these things that I've been told all of my life still applicable? Some of the things that may make you feel not good enough, not worthy, or these things are not right for whatever reason. Being able to take a look at those. So let's go ahead and, do you want to get me? Okay, so that does bring us to the Eight Circuit model of consciousness, which is a lot of our focus on how we're going to talk about a framework in which psychedelic experiences can fit into, and also, as I said at the beginning, potentially inform integration methods as well. So the eight-circuit model of consciousness was originally put forth by Timothy Leary back in the 60s when he was doing the original psychedelic research. This is like the legitimate research that he was doing out of Harvard before he went off and did a lot of other things. And the basic framework here is that it is delineated into 8 primary phases. We're going to go into each one of those and how they apply. The first 4 apply to developmental stages. These are pretty well reinforced in common psychological and developmental literature, so there's nothing necessarily profound in this other than how it might inform integration, or especially in the psychedelic space, or just generally inform how we're aware of our own processes internally. So developed by Timothy Leary, it's why revisit this model. There's of course been the huge resurgence in psychedelic research and interest, and so the application of this model still holds true, and what we've done in our forthcoming book is take a look at a lot of the more recent neuroscience research, psychological research, developmental research, and how it only served to sort of reinforce the model that was posited way back in the 60s. The eight-circuit model does provide a meta model that encompasses existing models, while also expanding to accommodate non-ordinary states of consciousness that might be experienced in psychedelics. So when you look at developmental psychology or most psychological models, they don't really encompass non-ordinary states too much. They just kind of stop at adulthood, and that's about the end of it. It also, as I said, sets a platform for integration, self-work, and development. Yeah, absolutely. On a more personal note, as far as the applications of this, I mean, this is a model that I've been using in trauma work clinically since I've been in practice, for the last 15 years. But with the resurgence in psychedelic interest, and now in Oregon and forthcoming in other places where you're getting actual formal training in working with psychedelics, and of course there are a number of psychedelic-assisted therapy programs as well. In my experience going through the training program, there was a wealth of information related to psychedelics, but there were questions that came up of okay, people are having these experiences, they're really hard to describe, but we recognize that they happen and they're common enough that they seem to be a thing. But what do we do with them? There wasn't much of a framework, and even when it was posited and asked very directly, and this has come up in conferences that I've attended and other people's talks, and there seems to be a real lacking of actual framework for putting these together and being able to work with them. There are a number of different interventions, and we'll talk briefly about how a lot of those key interventions kind of come into play and how they can be integrated in this model, but how this model allows for that framework. Yeah. So, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, and so again, the eight-circuit model was originally developed by Tim Leary back in the 70s, and then anybody's familiar with Robert Anton Wilson, he's kind of a counterculture, Korea ontologist, but he was he's a brilliant thinker. He brought it more onto a personal level, and Ansar Ali, who wrote the eight-circuit brain, who also developed it further and made it more practical with a lot of different exercises that you could utilize and experiment with in your own life. And there's current people into this model who have written contemporary books, including ourselves, and we're excited to announce also that our book was recently picked up by Original Falcon Press, who published the original works by Leary and Robert Anton Wilson and Ansar Ali. So we were originally hoping to...
Yeah, so we have pre-publication copies that if anybody's interested in, you can thumb through. They're not available for sale today, unfortunately. We were hoping to have them printed and available for sale, but because Original Falcon was fortunately invited us to be published through them, you're welcome to take a look. and then they will be forthcoming. But yeah, this is just a resource if anybody is interested in the eight-circuit model. These are some resources as far as material. And again, I'm happy to send these slides to anybody who's interested. So let's go real quickly through like I said, there's 8 circuits built into this. The first 4 are more foundational and more structural, and they fall into well-established psychological models. Just real briefly, in terms of critical periods, this is just showing the developmental periods and how different developmental periods tend to happen at different stages in life. So there are certain developmental windows or critical windows in infancy, and then some as you hit the 2-3-year-old, and then different changes that happen and different imprints that happen around age 7 or 8, and then around puberty and adolescence as well. There are some key brain changes that happen, and key phases of rapid neuroplasticity that happen as well. And if you dig into the critical period literature, you'll find discussions about the dynamics between how oxytocin plays a role in here, as well as biobehavioral synchrony, which basically means life experiences come into play. I'm not going to get too much into this because I want to be mindful of time, but worth also noting that this is something that can be directly impacted by a wide variety of life experiences. So if there are early life adverse experiences or different traumas that may come up, that these come into play in terms of influencing the critical periods, and sometimes shutting those down early, or sometimes opening them up too early in cases where somebody may have to take on more responsibility, or if they're a young child, may have to step into more of an adult role before they would naturally developmentally do so. So that comes into play here. These are the lower circuits, or the developmental circuits, circuit 1 through 4. Essentially, circuit 1 is imprinted around infanthood, and it has to do with safety. It has to do with engagement with the world, and whether or not you go forth and actively engage with the world, if the world feels safe, or if it feels dangerous and you sort of move inward and don't feel so safe. So there's the term neuroception, if anybody is familiar with that. That's a relatively new term that comes into play here. It's the ability to feel safe in one's environment. Circuit 2 is usually imprinted around the age of that 2-3-year-old, and it has to do with emotional needs, being more aware of one's emotion, also being aware of one's boundaries and being able to establish that. So, young children, they'll say no to everything. They'll learn no is a thing, and they can establish boundaries. And so, that's kind of where this comes into play. It has a correlation with Freud's anal stage. Circuit 3, the imprint happens around age 7 or 8, when we start engaging the frontal lobes a little bit more and more involved in active cognition and being able to logically think through different processes. Circuit 4 gets imprinted around adolescence, and it has to do with sociality, so there's this huge pivotal shift to more of a social component than the family unit, as well as finding the adult role, sexuality, and social expectations or morals, and so you can kind of think of this as the superego in a sense. So I'm not going to go over each one of these because we are pressed for time, but again, if you want a little bit more information on this, ask for the slides and I'll happily get it. But I want to really focus in on the transpersonal circuits. These are circuits 5 through 8. And do you want to get those, or you want me to? Sure. Okay. So circuit 5 is correlated with bliss states or euphoric states that can be activated either through psychedelic drugs, specifically more like cannabis or low doses of psilocybin. It's more of that reinforcement of belief systems as opposed to the breakthrough of belief systems. So it's ecstatic states. You can also access this through meditation and yogic practices and tantric practices. Circuit 6 is the metaprogramming circuit. So this is with each one of these, they become more broad and more complex in nature. So the circuit 6 tends to be activated or tapped into with medium to largest doses of psilocybin or LSD, and allows for the reflection or this ability to take a look at the belief systems or philosophical standpoints that we've come from, or these imprints that have happened previously in life, and being able to re-access that and or change that sort of with our will as we're able to take a look at it. So we become much more able to take volitional or conscious control of where we're at. Circuit 7 is activated with higher doses of psilocybin or LSD, as well as with DMT, and this is where experiences that have to do with archetypes, archetypal imagery, generational traumas that are related or instilled in our DNA, epigenetic components. Synchronicities tend to come up with these experiences, as well as interactions with non-human entities, so like your DMT elves and things like that come into play here. Circuit 8 is the non-dual state, completely transpersonal, out-of-body experience. It also has an association with dream states and near-death experiences. So again, we're not going to go over each one of those, but if you want the information, happy to provide it. In terms of how this applies to integration, there's a verticality relationship between the circuits. So there's a relationship between Circuit 1, the safety component, and Circuit 5, where you're using the body for these utilizing or experiencing somatic experiences that are ecstatic. And there's a relationship between Circuit 2 being able to form boundaries or focus on boundaries, and an ego stance, and Circuit 6 metaprogramming. And there's a relationship between map making or rationale or logic in Circuit 3 and Circuit 7 experiences. And there's a relationship between the social component, relational component of Circuit 4 with the non-dual states of Circuit 8. So if somebody has a very jarring psychedelic experience and they're having trouble integrating, you can utilize this relationship. And sometimes if they're having a hard time, like somebody has a profound Circuit 7 experience and they were visited by DMT elves and there was a lot of synchronicity and all of these archetypal figures, it can be helpful to sit down and actually write about this or create maps or draw lines and work to compartmentalize these. Whereas situations where you feel completely disembodied and you have these transpersonal non-dual experiences, it can be helpful to have a relational grounding dynamic to help bring that in and begin working with this. So again, we're kind of pressed for time, but this is how this starts to come into play. Also, spiritual emergencies come into play here, or what's traditionally or historically being called the dark night of the soul, in terms of being able to take a look at that and it's sort of a decentering, and being able to apply exercises that sort of engage these lower circuits or activate these brain areas or these emotions.
And how the lower circuits act as an anchor for some of these destabilizing experiences that happen when having a spiritual emergency. And so people who don't maybe doubt that like some of these non-ordinary states of consciousness are valid or they consider it as some type of pathology, and so to normalize it and to help to bring it back in the body and work with that experience.
Thank you. And then this is a list of different interventions or therapy methods that tend to have a tendency to be beneficial when working with a particular circuit. So if you know somebody has a really early life trauma, the well-known book, The Body Keeps the Score, their early life traumas are often somaticized. You don't have the verbal language yet. You don't have the mental maps built out. It becomes embodied, it's felt. And so there are certain interventions that lend itself to that, like somatic body work. By the same token, again, going back to the example of like a very heavy C7 experience where it's these very broad archetypal works, IFS could be a very effective intervention, or Jungian therapy that works with synchronicity or is at least very well informed in synchronicity and archetypes may lend itself to that. So this provides a broad map of different ways that it might be useful to address where somebody is having issues, especially if it's trouble with integration after a psychedelic experience. So that's a lot of information, try to cram into a really short period of time. Like we have a 30-hour course that we're putting together on this material. And like I said, we have a book coming out if you're interested. This is our contact information. And you can sign up for our newsletter or get information on updates on when the book is available. And like I said, feel free to reach out on slides or questions.